Hola, yo soy Korin de Argentina.
Yo soy Guilherme Perini de Brasil.
Y yo soy Joaquín Díaz de Chile. Y esto es Fase 3, tu podcast de análisis crítico en linfoma y leucemia linfocítica crónica.
En español
y en portuñol.
Bienvenidos todos, una vez más, a un nuevo episodio de este subpodcast en linfomas y leucemia linfocítica crónica. Y esta vez, ¿por qué no? Un poco de mieloma múltiple, fase 3. Esta vez, además de mis habituales coanfitriones Laura y Guilherme, tenemos a un invitado extremadamente especial. Se trata del doctor Manni Mohyuddin, que trabaja en el Instituto de Cáncer Huntsman en la Universidad de Utah. Y él, si lo conocen o lo siguen en redes sociales, es un especialista de hematología con foco en mieloma. Y la verdad es que sus puntos de vista respecto a mielomas, endpoints, ensayos clínicos, son algo importante. Y más de una vez ha tenido un encuentro con nuestro Guilherme Perini respecto a qué pasa con nuestros pacientes cuando los enrolamos en ensayos clínicos. Así que este podcast por esta ocasión va a ser en inglés. Después les daremos nuestros comentarios, pero vamos a iniciar preguntándole al doctor Mohyuddin respecto a ética y eventos de ética en ensayos clínicos relacionados con ensayos clínicos de cáncer a nivel global. Así que ahora me voy al inglés. Welcome everyone to Phase 3, your podcast in lymphoma and CLL, and now a bit of myeloma. Here we have Dr. Manni Mohyuddin from the Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. And well, he's well known for his expertise and focus on myeloma and clinical trials. And we are very thankful that you came to this discussion. And I hope we have a very fine conversation, very nuanced conversation about clinical trials, global clinical trials, and the impact that they have for approval, for access. And maybe we get into a bit of a fight. I see Guilherme brought the gloves. So thank you, Dr. Mohyuddin, for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm going to start with the first controversy, if I may. There's a lot of conversations around Twitter if someone who does not participate in clinical trials is allowed to criticize clinical trials. We have all conflicts of interest because we are investigators in clinical trials sponsored by industry, even though we criticize them in our podcast. But what's your thought about it?
So it's a great question. And I will start off by saying that everybody who sees patients should have an opinion about clinical trials, and they should have an opinion about data and translating the results of clinical trials to practice, because that is a lot of what we do, is that we synthesize information from clinical trials onto our practice. And I think it's very, very important to be able to appraise clinical trials. And that goes for everybody in the United States and in many, many areas of the world. It is community oncologists who they may participate in some trials, but they generally are not, leading trials or writing trials. They are the ones that are synthesizing the results of the trials, translating it for their patients, and applying it to daily patient care. So I absolutely believe that everybody, ranging from medical student to resident to fellow, other patients, patient advocates, I think that everybody should be able to appraise a clinical trial. Now, the one nuance that I will accept and I will admit is when you actually run trials, it does give you a lot more perspective. And I think that I see a change in my own views, and a change. Perhaps I'm more grounded in my own opinions and in reality, because over the last 3 years of being faculty, I've started a few investigator-initiated trials, and I'm working with our cooperative group to hopefully run a large randomized trial, and it's humbling. And you recognize that there are so many compromises that are made along the way, And what you think that your trial is going to be is sometimes very different than what your trial ends up being. So I recognize that there are compromises that have to be made, and some things you recognize only after you've been in that position. But the short answer to your question is that everyone should be entitled to have an opinion on a clinical trial and be able to appraise and criticize a clinical trial, because the results of the clinical trial form the basis of what all of us do in clinical practice every day.
And can you tell us a bit about yourself, about your everyday as a doctor, time you is allocated to research for clinical assistance, everything?
Absolutely. Like, allow me to just start by telling you a little bit about my background. So I am from Pakistan originally. I did my medical school in Pakistan. My first exposure to oncology was in Pakistan. Pakistan is very much a lower middle income country. I remember very vividly my first exposure to oncology was, seeing tons of patients in a small waiting room getting, oncology, getting their chemotherapy drugs infused, and they're all crammed in one small room. And that's basically was a very lasting, profound impression. And then 50 to 60 patients crammed in one workday, and not being able to have nuanced, detailed conversations. That was and a lot of people denying treatment, but not getting treatment because they couldn't afford it. Seeing some people sell their houses, sell their life's worth for some last resort chemotherapy. That is what I saw while as a medical student, and it had a very profound impression on me. I moved to the US for residency. That started in 2014, and I finished my fellowship in 2021. So I have now been faculty for 3 years, and I focus on multiple myeloma. I am very clinically heavy. I am about 80% clinical. So that translates to about 2.5 days of clinic a week. And it translates to about 12 weeks of inpatient bone marrow transplant and hematology service. So that's fairly busy clinically, but I am very passionate about research, and I am able to get some research done. And the kind of research topics that I'm passionate about all relate to myeloma, but basically supportive care, less is more concepts, high value care. So I'm running a trial which is looking at using budesonide to reduce diarrhea during transplant. It's a randomized placebo-controlled trial, endpoint of diarrhea. I'm the primary investigator of this investigator-initiated trial. I'm also running a trial at smoldering myeloma, where we are not doing any intervention, but we are getting MRIs every 6 months and labs very closely. And we aim to show that with this prospective protocol, we can keep patients with smoldering myeloma safe of treatment. I have received funding from industry for a small trial in newly diagnosed ultra frail patients, which will be the first trial of ultra frail adults with myeloma. Hopefully that'll be public information soon. And I am working with a cooperative group in the United States, the Southwest Oncology Group, to run a large randomized study of trying to omit Revlimid maintenance for people with myeloma who respond very well. So that's a little bit about my practice. And obviously I get in trouble because I write on controversial issues and I tweet about controversial issues. We try to be provocative and make people think differently. And I take great pride in that, in raising awareness and making people just think differently in a respectful fashion.
Hi, Manny. First, thank you for being here. I'm probably the one that the reason you are here, and I thank you very much for being here. And I really like your point on writing controversial things and things like that. One thing that people need to understand is that most of the time when we're on Twitter, we're a persona, right? We're writing things that maybe are controversial, and maybe will make some people get mad or some people get angry, and even when we're exchanging our our tweets, it's of course nothing personal. We've met before, and it's very nice to meet you. My question is, did you get any hit from your tweets when you're starting your own research and your own trials? People would just say, this guy, he talks too much on Twitter and things like that. How Twitter impacts in your practice, like on a daily basis?
That's a great question. So there's lots of positive things and there are some negative things, and I'm going to tell you both. The positive things are that I have been able to meet people and interact with people where I would have never had the opportunity to do so without Twitter. So I can name a few people who I'm running trials with them. I have written over like 10 papers with them, participated in reviews with each of them. I can name multiple people, and Twitter was the sole reason why I got to know these people. And I think Twitter has really expanded the reach of my own work. I think that nobody would really read my papers before Twitter, and now, some people read it. And I think that Twitter is a great way for me to keep up with medical information, because if you follow the right people, you'll find out what's going on in the field. Those are all incredibly positive things. I do think that there are negative things, and I think that even though I personally try to never be personal, like and I might have failed a few times, but I try to not do personal attacks. I try to criticize a study. But even if if you're criticizing a study, even with the best intentions, it will be perceived as a personal attack sometimes, because people are very invested in their studies. They've spent hours and hours, weeks, months, years of their time on a study. And now some random person who they don't know, who is very junior to them, like goes on Twitter and criticizes their study, they're going to feel personally offended. And I think I felt that, right? Like I've been trolled on Twitter, and I'm not a victim by any means. I'm just sort of, telling you the story, but like I've received pushback, and, I'll tell you this one story without naming anybody, but, for one of my trials, I wanted to get, I reached out for collaboration, and, I was told that, we don't really want to collaborate with you. And I think that was in part because of, something I might have said on Twitter. So I think that it's opened more doors, absolutely, but it has closed a few doors. And I think that overall, if my goal in life was to be the single biggest key opinion leader in myeloma, and my goal was to become the head of all of these myeloma societies, I think that what I'm doing would be wrong, because I am not helping that goal, right? If you want to be the biggest KOL, you should never criticize anything on Twitter. You should just write, great paper, congratulations. All you should do is that, and that will get you to your goal. If you start criticizing, even if it's very, very respectful, you are eventually going to close some doors. That is one advice I will give to trainees. If you are authentic to yourself, you can criticize, right? Like, but you need to know what your goals are, right? And you will see that most people on Twitter do not criticize anything because they've seen like what happens when you criticize, even if it's with the best of intentions. And I do think that some doors, unfortunately, do get closed. But overall, I am extremely happy and thankful for where I am professionally in my life. And I think Twitter has played a part in that. I think the reason why I am here today is also because of Twitter, right? But the reason why I know you all and you know me is because of Twitter. And I'm thankful for the opportunity.
Okay, I want to get into the heart of the discussion. So every once in a while, industry sponsors a trial that gets criticized because of the control arm or because of what is the scientific value. And it is run globally, and some countries like ours do benefit by accessing certain drugs because of the trial, even though it might not be the optimal design. So can you explain to us how is the access to high-cost drugs in the United States where you work, and what are the different kinds of ways people access that are not related to clinical trials, and how do they relate to the reality we have?
Absolutely. So the US is a great place to be if you have a rare cancer and if you have good health insurance. It is the best place in the world to be. It's probably not the best place in the world to be for common conditions, right? The US is behind other developed countries for common things like good blood pressure control, childhood vaccinations, fetal, mortality, maternal mortality. We lag behind. But if you have cancer and you have access to healthcare, you have health insurance, it's a great place to be. The reason why is that the drugs are available before anywhere else in the world. They are available in the United States. We have FDA approval, but even before formal FDA approval of a specific product, there are pathways in the United States through which you can get insurance company to pay for drugs. So we have national guidelines called the NCCN guidelines. And the NCCN guidelines, if anything gets listed on the NCCN guidelines, and a lot of the options that are listed on the NCCN guidelines are, they have phase 2 data, sometimes promising phase 1 data, sometimes phase 3 data, but often, it's like phase 2 data. If it gets listed on the NCCN guidelines, then insurance companies are supposed to pay for it. So, for example, if I wanted to get daratumumab, carfilzomib, Revlimid, dexamethasone to my patient, it's listed in the NCCN guidelines. I can give it. Venetoclax is not approved by the FDA, but venetoclax is available for other blood cancers, and it's listed in the NCCN guidelines. So I can give venetoclax for myeloma with translocation 1114. There are a lot of things that we are able to do because things get put on the NCCN guidelines. So if you have health insurance, you generally will get access to these drugs. Obviously, you may live in a rural area and you may not have access to a big academic center, so you may not get access to things like CAR-T and transplant and bispecifics. But overall, and obviously there are disparities of, there are ethnic disparities, geographic disparities, racial disparities. But by and large, the US has good access to cancer drugs. If anything, I would say that there are debates that we're too permissive in allowing some low value drugs, and society pays for the cost of those drugs, right? Everybody's health insurance premium is rising. But by and large, short answer to your question is that if you have health insurance, there are excellent pathways to getting the drug. Sometimes insurance company gives you a difficult time because they may disagree with, a specific drug. Generally speaking, there are pathways to challenge that. And sometimes if all of that fails, you can often, at least at an academic center, I acknowledge I have a lot of resources, you can get the drug company to pay for the drug sometimes if the insurance company says no. So there are disparities, but multiple pathways exist to get good drugs on time for our patients, generally speaking.
And how many patients do not have health insurance?
So that's a really good question. And I actually would have to look up what the exact statistic is for that. I really apologize that I don't know the statistic off the top of my head. I acknowledge my bias at being at an academic center, and seeing patients that even if they don't have insurance, we generally end up getting it for them. So I'm just looking up quickly right now. 92% of people in the US had some sort of health insurance in the year 2022. So it's the majority of people. Like some insurance is great, some insurance is less great, but most people have some sort of health insurance.
We hear a lot of information in scientific meetings about what's the standard of care and what you do in the US, but it's mostly from academic centers. And when you look into the real world data, it not usually translates into the real world setting. So when we hear you or another leaders talk about the control arms and how unfair they are, and I mostly agree that they are unfair and that they are not the US standard. But I think that I don't know if of all the patients in the US or most of the patients in the US get the academic standard of treatment, or if the reality is what we see in the real world data where most of the patients get, I don't know, for example, I was surprised in looking into the data of the real world use of high dose cytarabine in mantle cell lymphoma in the US, and it was like really low, much lower than we do here in Argentina, in Latin America. So I think that I know maybe most of the control arms or some of the control arms are unfair or are subpar what you do in the US, but I think it translates into what you do in academic centers and not so much in other clinical settings. What's your view on this?
So you raise a very good point, and I think there are multiple aspects of addressing the point that you raised. So one aspect is that you are right that there are lots of differences in how blood cancers are treated in the community versus in academics. Some of that is access, like things like transplant and things like being able to hospitalize your patient and give them fancy treatments. And some of that is access to trials. Some of them is access to things like CAR-T and bispecifics. Some of that is also education. Like, when you're a community oncology doctor, you see a lot of cancers, and you may be a little behind in, what is the newest thing out there. And for good or for worse, sometimes academic docs start doing things that aren't good, right? They just think they're doing something new and fancy. But for good or for worse, we move in academia, we move faster than community. So some of that is access, some of that is education. The most important point that I want to drive home is that the differences within the US, whether they are between academic sites and community sites, or whether they are between different racial minorities, they are very small compared to differences between the US and other countries. And I think that we lose sight of the bigger picture. We publish so many papers on, racial disparities in the US and different disparities, within the US. But the reality is that wherever you are in the US, you will get much, much, much better care than the majority of the world, right? So I always find it very strange when people from Pakistan and India, they come to the US and then they start publishing paper after paper after paper about racial disparities in the US. I mean, I'm sure they're genuine. We should assume that. But I'm like, hey, have you forgotten, what you saw back home? Like that difference was huge compared to the difference within the US. So, and even within the US and Latin America, the huge difference compared to the difference within America, in my humble opinion.
And do you think that those differences impair like running global clinical trials?
So the short answer is that no. And I will say that, so my view is very idealistic, and Dr. Perini will probably have a different viewpoint, but I'm going to give you my idealistic viewpoint here, and that's what I want to strive for. So the trials are designed by pharma. They are, the design is submitted to the FDA before the trial is officially opened, and the FDA basically green lights the trial design and allows it to proceed. And a lot of academic doctors who are at academic centers, who are publishing viewpoints and papers, they are on board, like they're part of the trial steering committee and the trial design, all right? And they firmly believe that, their standard is different and their standard is better. The perfect example of this, and it'll be easier if I, give you an example, is think of myeloma treatment and think of daratumumab, Revlimid, dexamethasone, which has increasingly become the standard for frontline treatment in older transplant ineligible patients. Is there a randomized comparison between Dara, Lendex, and Velcade Lendex that says that Dara Lendex is better? No, there isn't. There's one, there's some ongoing stuff, but there's no direct randomized trial that says that it's better. But, if you compare the PFS or you compare the safety profile and you compare what academic doctors are saying, if you see what Janssen is saying, everybody's saying Dara Lendex is better. Even in real world, Dara Lendex is increasingly being utilized. Janssen has published a study that Dara Lendex, it's a modeling study, which I personally think is BS. But however, that study has shown that Dara Lendex, if you give it upfront, you will get 2 more years of survival, overall survival, compared to Velcade Lendex. So they obviously believe it if they're publishing the study. So now, if they are running trials, and daratumumab is their own drug, so Janssen makes this drug, okay? It's not that they can't access it, they made this drug. So if they are now running trials in a similar patient population, transplant ineligible older adults with myeloma, this standard of care should be Dara Lendex. They make the drug, Dara, they can give it. They already think it's better. People in the US are already using it. It should be the standard. You should not use an excuse that, it's not conclusively shown to be better than VRD. This is your own drug. You make Dara, okay? So they are now, there's a trial called CARTITUDE-5, which Dr. Perini and I have, argued about on Twitter. But that trial is now using VRD as the control arm, and then the intervention arm gets VRD, but then after VRD, they get Cilta-cel, okay? And that's great, right? Cilta-cel might, transform the natural history of this. But the control arm, they're enrolling really fit people. Like Cilta-cel is not a joke. Cilta-cel has higher treatment-related mortality than auto transplant. There was one paper published, yesterday that treatment-related mortality of Cilta-cel is 14.5% or around 15%. Huge. It's not safer than transplant. It's more risky. If somebody's fit enough to get cilta-cel, they can get quad, they can get, they could do a transplant, they could get, a lot of other things. But the control arm gets just VRD, and after 8 cycles, Velcade is dropped and it's just Revlimid. It is such a low bar. Obviously, PFS will be better. Would it have been better if they had given their own control arm Dara-Lendex, which they very well could have, right? Which people are now using. Obviously, I think that the control arm would do better and the trial will be a lot more informative. This is not something new. They have known this for years. We have been complaining about this for years. This trial has struggled to enroll in the US. And I know of this because, some of my friends tell me it's not open at my site, but every so often the sponsor sends an email. Hey, we need more African Americans in the US. We need more people in the US, we're not enrolling enough. Why do you think it's not enrolling in the US? Because everybody recognizes that the control arm is shitty. Okay, forgive my language, but everybody recognizes that, the control arm is bad. So it's mostly enrolling outside the US where VRD is actually pretty good, right? Because your alternative would be, thalidomide or cyclophosphamide-based regimens. So I don't disagree. I think that this trial, even in its current format, is a net good for LMICs. It's a net good if it runs in Latin America. You guys are doing the right thing. If I was there, if I think of my time in Pakistan, it would be so much better, right? You're getting it free. The patient is not bankrupting themselves to get the drug. But I stand by my opinion that Janssen could have done better. They could have done Dara-Lendex, and your patients would get even better therapy than what they're getting. That is my point. This is not a point about your morals, the morals or ethics of people in LMICs. It is not I acknowledge that it is better than existing standard in LMICs, but I insist that, if your intention is regulatory approval in the US, you have to have a better control arm. That is my point. And I think that it's hard to make this point respectfully on Twitter with all the space constraints. So you have to, synthesize and condense. And sometimes it ends up being very provocative, right? And I acknowledge that some of my tweets are provocative, but that is my point. And that's what I want to say.
But let me jump in here. One of the things that we discuss a lot is the power of words. So sometimes some tweets can be very provocative and maybe sometimes offensive. And I have recently have a discussion on the power of the word unethical, right? Because unethical means there is a active action that is breaking the ethics or breaking the best interest of your patient. And that's probably the one thing that hurts me, and that's why we have our exchanges in Twitter, is that from my point of view, right, it's not it would be unethical not to put my patients on the trial. So my question for you is, how can we address these issues, including younger investigators from low middle income countries that are probably doing their best, to put patients on trials without making the trials or the PIs and the investigators feeling that they're doing something bad for the patient. Because the other thing is Twitter is an open space. So you can, one patient can read, I'm participating on this trial, but I just read this guy, from Utah, very famous, a lot of followers, and he's saying that this trial is unethical. How can we, how we can discuss the trials and try to make them better, but at the same time keep some nuance on the discussion so that we don't, open, the discussion for a pointing fingers situation.
Absolutely. So you raise very good points. And I think that part of this is the problem of Twitter itself, because you have space limitations. And even though nowadays you can get around the space limitations, you want to be concise in your message. And when I say unethical, I recognize, and I'm at fault here, I recognize that this will be perceived by some people as a direct like insult to them. And when I'm on a platform like this, I can qualify and explain in more detail, like what I mean when I say unethical, but I can't necessarily always do that every single time on Twitter because of the nature of the platform. And that's why it's so great that we are having this discussion, because in reality, we probably see alike, right? So when I say unethical, I say it's unethical from the standpoint of the drug company, because they could have done a better control arm. And that is specifically what I'm saying, that the company has done an unethical move. And I know it's a bold word, but I intentionally want to use it because I think that you can't mince words when you want to enact change. And this is a serious problem that we don't talk about often. But the drug company is indeed unethical. The fault in this specific situation, and the fault lies with the drug company. I think that regulatory authorities have the power to address this, and they have the power to demand better control arms, because the FDA, they do green light these designs, right? And they should have a better control arm and demand a better control arm rather than do just one acceptable lower standard. But it is absolutely ethical for investigators in LMICs to enroll, because if you look at what it is comparing to as far as other option is concerned, this is better, right? Like the drug is being provided, you are getting structured care as part of a trial. It is better than thalidomide and cyclophosphamide and a lot of other things. And if you're on the intervention arm, you might get something that's actually really, really good that would transform the natural history. So it's not unethical for an individual investigator in an LMIC to do so. I do think, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, but on a trial like this trial I mentioned, CARDITUDE-5, if you enroll in the US and you are at an academic center and you give all your other patients data VRD, or you do a transplant, or you do some other fancy intensive thing, and you put them on this control arm, and you give them just VRD after 8 cycles, and you drop it, Velcade, and you do just Revlimid, and that is different than what your practice would have been otherwise, you are doing something unethical, in my opinion. I recognize this is a controversial thing to say, and there are lots of caveats. Maybe in the community, I often do get community referrals. People are still doing VRD, right? And that's changing with time, but and for somebody like that, probably not unethical. But if you are an academic doctor and CARDITUDE-5 in the US is enrolling at some academic sites, you knew better. You were writing papers about how PFS is the goal, DRD is better and all of those things. I do think it's a little hypocritical for you to say on one hand that, just VRD is, not enough. VRD is dead. There are people who I deeply love on Twitter who've said VRD is dead. Well, if you say VRD is dead, how can you support a trial that still has VRD as a control arm? So
I agree. Just let me one question. I don't do myeloma. I have no relation with Janssen. I'm not defending any drugs here. So I really don't talk anything about myeloma. So CARDITUDE-5 was written in 2021, where probably at the time, I don't know, maybe you could tell us a little bit that at that time there was some discussion about what would be the standard of care. But even if we're talking about other trials that they are written in a time where one standard of care was one combination and then it changes to another, how do you think we could, because at the same time, if we change the control arm during the trial, that can be some problem, statistical analysis and things like that. So how can we keep up with good practice in clinical trials in a field that is changing year to year, with new standard of cares and things like that?
So this is a very good point. And we've actually done a paper in myeloma where we've looked at when a trial was known to have an inferior control arm before even a single patient was enrolled versus when a trial had a control arm that became inferior to something else during the conduct of a trial. I recognize that changing a trial is a huge deal. You have to go, there's lots of regulatory steps involved with each of the country that the trial is running in. It's a huge deal. However, in this case, DARA Lendex was published in 2019 in NEJM, and the abstract was published before then, and Janssen had access to data before then. So I think that this is a perfect example of, a really unethical trial that could very well have been prevented because they knew that there was another regimen that was better. But there are some other examples where there is a lot of nuance, and I think that it's a very difficult decision, and I don't know the right answer, right? Because on one hand, the drug company has invested a lot of money and a lot of effort, and future patients will benefit from the results of this trial. But my goal is always primarily to benefit the patient that is in front of me, right? And that is my philosophy on how I approach medicine. Like, I will say no to a trial if it is not good for my patient in front of me, even if the trial is good for my career, even if my institution gets more money from the trial. And that's a tough one, right? Because there's a net benefit to society for letting such a trial that became unethical during the conduct. It is a net benefit to letting that trial continue, but it may not be great for my patient. I think in these situations, it's very nuanced. And I think that we do an injustice if we call all these trials unethical, because they probably aren't, right? Because they were designed with the best of intentions at the time they started. And down the road, they became the control arm became inferior, but there was nuance. I think if it happens very early on in the course of a trial, I think that you probably could make a case to change. But if it happens after the bulk of people have been enrolled, you probably should just continue and finish the results. But I think that we owe it to our patients to tell them, these are the results. And in LMICs, perhaps, it's better than the other options anyway, so it's a little less relevant. But in the US, I think we owe it to our patients to tell them, that there might be other things we could give them that may be better than, the control arm. So it's very, very nuanced. And I acknowledge that, sometimes during my conversations with pharma, they say that the problem is not because of them. The problem is because of regulatory authorities. They say that the FDA made us do this, or the EMA is very rigid and they don't allow this as a control arm. And so I think that, maybe part of the blame lies that with regulatory authorities and with them being so rigid. And this entire infrastructure is so rigid and it's so bureaucratic, right? That I think that we are actually now hurting innovation, and we are hurting our patients by having such a bureaucratic, stiff system. And again, I'm just talking about it. This is not in my hands, but I think that this is a very acute problem, and we owe it to our patients to sort of come up with solutions to reduce the bureaucracy and make this system more nimble. Like, it should be easier to change things. And there is some precedent. Some trials have changed. There was an ALL trial done through a cooperative group in which, blinatumomab, we found out blinatumomab was really good. So they did change the control arm, but I wish it happened more often, in my opinion. And we owe it to our patients to make the system more nimble. And I recognize I sound very theoretical when I say this, but I aspire for change and I want to articulate it and work towards it.
But I think this highlights a need for a global mindset when designing these trials, because pharma will usually design trials relating to seeking approval of the FDA for marketing authorization, and after that for changing the lines of therapy. And but they usually have these requisites for like diversity and inclusion of global populations. And we used to be like passive witnesses, and now we have been called into action, and we are enrolling patients in these trials, and that has that makes us participants, and we want to participate because we get access that we used to not get. So now the thing, it's very important to try to define criteria for the control arms, defined by benefits that are very tangible. So I've seen you a lot of times talk about like we would like to have overall survival as an endpoint in myeloma, that it's very difficult, and we're looking for surrogates, and PFS has behaved not in the best way, and we are now facing MRD as an endpoint. But we should strive to have a criteria to define control arms that could be worked globally, because right now data-RBD is very used in the United States, but I do not think it's a global control arm or standard for a control arm for a clinical trial.
And we're not even talking about low and middle income countries. It's probably not approved in Spain or in United Kingdom. So yes, I think it's a very tough discussion to make a global trial. At the same time, there is this idea that trials are usually run to get FDA approval, but at the same time, you cannot, maybe you can afford, but sometimes, most of the time, you don't afford the control arm of the US. So it really is a very tough discussion to run these trials.
Yeah, so I'll offer some points here. So one of the points is that I firmly believe that, so I guess first of all, we should highlight the truth, which is that the bulk of money that a drug company makes is from the US, right? That is how they get money back from, all of the money they've put in and, running the trial, getting the drug to market, all of that. They get all their money back by, charging extremely high rates in the US. So that is one fact. I'm not a health economist, but that is a well-known fact. So I personally believe that if the intent of a drug company is to get US FDA approval, the control arm should be a US standard of care. I also am aware that there is no law that would stop a drug company from giving a control arm that is actually better than the prevailing standard of care in an LMIC. So, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but the Brazilian authority is not going to be like, hey, you can't give Dara-Lendex. You have to give Velcade Revlimid Dex to the control arm. They're not going to force you to give an inferior control arm. If you wanted to give a better control arm, even if it was not available, but the drug company was giving it, they could go ahead and give it. All right. So yes. I think that because but the pharma will choose the lowest possible, barrier, right? So they'll go with the lowest control arm because they can, because FDA is not making them accountable. We are not making them accountable. And that is what they choose to do. So that is and this is an idealistic take, but I really do want to, this is the change I want to enact. If your intent of your trial is to get regulatory approval in the US, your control arm should be a US standard, even if that standard is above the prevailing standard of care in an LMIC. You can give it. Now, I recognize that sometimes I am very, very, very idealistic and I'm wrong. Okay. So I'm not perfect. And I wrote a tweet a little while ago about this new BCMA CAR T. All right. It's a DD-BCMA, or it's called anito-cel. And I tweeted that, we should have head-to-head CAR T comparisons. Why is this being compared to another triplet? We should have this compared to Abecma or Carvykti. And I thought about, that tweet also got some pushback. And then I thought about it a lot. And then I'm like, okay, this is too idealistic, right? Expecting the pharma company to pay and arrange for Carvykti as a control arm in every country it runs is probably unrealistic, right? So I recognize that this is too idealistic. And I'm probably wrong in wanting that. But the example I gave you of Carditude 5 is very realistic. It was the drug that Janssen itself was making and then denying to the control arm. So there is nuance, and I sometimes am very idealistic and I'm wrong. And you raised the point about overall survival. I think that overall survival ideally is good, but I've thought a lot about this, and I've been in this. I've been seeing myeloma every day for 3 years. I've been running trials, and I think that it is sometimes not practical, and I agree.
Aha!
I've said
now
that.
we're talking.
So, and I think that especially for newly diagnosed myeloma, it's not practical. I think that it is very important to follow it, but it's not practical. I concede like 100% that it's not practical. And I've written a paper about this. We've done an analysis. PFS does not correlate with OS for newly diagnosed myeloma, but that is because you get therapies that relapse, and your PFS1 plus PFS2 plus PFS3 will probably almost certainly correlate with OS, but your PFS1 won't, because you get other therapies that relapse, and that sort of lessens the interaction between PFS and OS. For heavily relapsed myeloma, PFS, for the most part, there are some exceptions, is actually a decent surrogate. Not perfect, but decent. So I recognize that for newly diagnosed myeloma, OS is probably not practical. It pains me to say this, but it's a good problem to have because outcomes are so good. So I think that, to insist on just OS is very idealistic. My vision is that your control arm should be the best available control arm in the United States that has shown a good result for the endpoint you are running your trial for. And this is what I want. So if you have something that has shown a better PFS, that should be your control arm. You should not use OS as an excuse. And I've seen sometimes people say an excuse that we don't know if OS is better with Velcade, Revlimid, Dex, or with quad, or with quads, or with one particular thing. So that's why it's okay to do this control arm. That is hypocritical. For everything else you use PFS. Why is it that for control arm, it's okay to use something inferior for PFS as long as you don't know the OS? So I believe in internal consistency. All right. You got to be consistent and true to yourself. And, that is my philosophy to life.
Now that you're talking about PFS1 and PFS2, the item of post-protocol therapies arise, and it's quite relevant in global clinical trials, because in low middle income countries, maybe post-protocol care isn't good enough or isn't as robust as you have in the US, all the possibilities, and that may impact the OS results in a study. So how do you feel about crossover? And do you think that this could solve the issue of post-protocol therapies in global clinical trials?
So I personally think that the post-protocol therapy is an easier issue to fix than the control arm issue, because we've already spoken about how complex it is, what the control arm is and all. My philosophy, and this has been articulated by people that are smarter than me, is that if you have a drug that already works in the relapse refractory setting and you are moving it to an earlier line of therapy, and that is what your trial is about, you should give that drug upon progression. And that is often not done, right? If you look at the Maya trial, which was a randomized trial of Dara, Lendex versus Lendex for newly diagnosed myeloma. This was after we knew daratumumab worked for relapsed myeloma. Now, when the control arm, Lendex, of this trial, people relapse in that control arm, they should get daratumumab. Wherever they're in the world, Janssen should give them daratumumab, but the majority of people didn't, right? Like, the most commonly used regimens were like old school regimens, and daratumumab was used for less than 50% at the first relapse. If you look at another trial called the Alcyone trial, similarly, daratumumab-based regimens was only given to the control arm in about 10% of patients. So really, really low and really, really sad. And I think that is easy to fix relatively, because the drug company can provide access. You don't have to, go through regulatory authorities and change control arms midway. If you know your drug works upon in a later setting, you should give it. Conversely, if your drug is unknown whether it works or not, you probably shouldn't cross people over to it, because then you will not be able to comment on an OS result, right? So I think that there's nuance here. But a lot of the OS results that we get from myeloma trials are often uninterpretable. I still don't know if Dara frontline is better than Dara later for OS because of lack of good crossover, lack of good post-protocol therapy. I have adopted quads and I've adopted Dara frontline because of, it improves PFS quite a bit, right? I recognize PFS as imperfect, but if you're improving PFS without a lot of extra toxicity, and your patient themselves are not paying the cost financially for this, it is probably worth it. it's what I would want for myself. So I can't be a hypocrite and be like, hey, I don't know OS, but I think that if you get extra mileage with PFS without impairing quality of life, and there's a reasonable chance that with long-term follow-up, and we're talking really long-term follow-up, it might translate to OS, you absolutely should adopt it rather than wait for OS, which can take a very, very long time. So post-protocol therapy is easier to fix. And I sincerely believe that, that is something that we all can work on. So along those lines, I want to ask a question, and I'm going to ask this in a very respectful way. It's a provocative question. So my question to you all is, so in LMICs, you run these trials, right? So you ran this belantamab trial, you ran, some daratumumab trials. Like now, if you want to give your patient belantamab or daratumumab or something outside of a trial, like, do you have access to it? And the follow-up question is, shouldn't you have access because your country participated in getting this drug approved by the FDA? You guys played such a pivotal part. Doesn't the pharma company owe it to you all to provide access? After you participated, you provided patients, your patients made sacrifices, they were in the control arm, and you spent so much effort and time on this. Like, doesn't the pharma company owe something to you all to provide access later? That is my question to you all, and I'd love to actually genuinely understand more about this.
In Argentina, we have approvals at the same time as the FDA almost. So it's a rare situation, and it's different from Brazil, for example. So we have access to DARA. We are probably going to have access real soon to bispecifics in myeloma. So we have several opportunities for our patients outside clinical trials, but approvals doesn't mean access for most of our patients, because insurance isn't obliged to pay for the drugs only because it's approved by our regulatory agency. So it kind of put us, the primary care doctors, in a hurry and in a difficult situation, because there's a drug available, but you don't always access to it, even if you prescribe it and the prescription is right. It's according to approval. And I have several discussions with the pharma-sponsored trial in my country, and I said to them, for example, in DLBCL, it's a huge problem in my country because we don't have access to RT or bispecifics yet. We only have POLA approved. So, for example, we have many confirmatory trials that enroll well in low middle income countries, like in Latin American countries, due to our situation, but don't enroll well in the US. So I was telling them that I thought it was unethical for them not to give the patients a drug that was approved, even though it was approved in an accelerated way in the US. But I don't get success with my my discussions with them. So I get the feeling that at least 50% of the patients that I enroll can get the drug, that it's the only way for them to get it in a clinical trial. And I, as a doctor, get experience with a drug that I wouldn't be able to give outside the clinical trial. So I know I don't feel well in that situation, mostly if the patient gets the control arm. So I think it's an ethical issue for us too. But I think outside the clinical trial, it would be what I would give them anyway. So that is at least consoling for me, because I'm not doing anything unethical. I wouldn't have a better treatment outside the clinical trial. But I don't feel comfortable with that situation, because I know they would get it outside in the US, outside the clinical trial without a problem, and I can give them the same post-protocol therapy in my country.
So Dr. Perini, what about Brazil? I really want to understand this.
Yeah, so Brazil is a huge country where we have around 220 million people. And I would say that 75% of the population doesn't have access, doesn't have insurance, so they rely on our public system. And in our public system, the approvals for drugs are very, very delayed. As I've been talking to Twitter regarding CLL, for example, we just have approval of rituximab in first-line therapy for CLL. In myeloma, I would say we have access to Velcade and nothing more than that in first-line therapy. So most of the patients will be treated with CyberD or VTD or something like that. So participating in clinical trials doesn't make a drug being more prone to be approved or not. And they're usually approved first for the insurance, and then 20 years later, they're approved for the public system. So I don't feel any hurt or any problem when I enroll my patients, because as you said, my point is to advocate for my patients, and my patients are doing better on clinical trials. They're doing FISH. We don't have FISH in the public system, right? They're doing maybe zoledronic acid or all other support therapies that would not be approved in the public system. So in Brazil, I think we, the ones that run trials here, we're more worried about giving the best option we can get, knowing that maybe sometimes the trials may be scientifically less important, but as long as I can give, for my patient a better therapy, I would be fine with that. So I think it's more a social issue here in Brazil than in other countries in Latin America. And the thing is, we have a very big country I'm in São Paulo. I mean, like in New York City, it's a big city and you have better options, but there are some places in Brazil that even the basics are very, very difficult to get. So I am totally good having these patients on trial. So if you guys don't want to run that in the US, just bring them to Brazil. We'll be very, very okay with that.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, it's very different. And I know you have a very strong background. And I sometimes I wonder if you have contact with your colleagues in Pakistan, and if they feel, if they have the same perception you have on trials. I may assume, I'm not sure about that maybe there are not a lot of trials being run on Pakistan. So there's probably something that there's not, a big discussion, but how would you feel if Pakistan was running this trial? Would you have the same strong opinions as how things work there, right?
Yeah, so I think that the Pakistan situation is probably very similar to Brazil in the sense that, and I know for a fact that Pakistan does not generally run a lot of these large trials. And that's because in many ways our infrastructure, even at academic institutions, is even worse than the academic infrastructure at Brazil. Like, we just don't have the ability to follow up and do CAR-T, even at like those good academic centers. I know that if theoretically these trials ran, like they would enroll our physicians would love to enroll them, even if the control arm was far inferior to US standard, just because of, it's better than what is available otherwise in Pakistan. So the situation in many areas in Pakistan is so bad that even like the drug companies are not confident enough to run their trials in those institutions. So again, lots of nuance, and I am in touch. And last time I visited Pakistan, I went to one of this cancer center, and it's just, it brings you back to the reality that you saw in med school, and not much has changed, unfortunately, right? 10 years later, there's still so many patients, there's still limited resources, people are still selling their houses, they have to pay from, out of pocket and selling their life savings, and it's very depressing to see. And, kudos to the people who are able to do that. And I acknowledge that I'm very privileged, and, there's a bit of a survivor's guilt as well, right? Like I've left that, and now I have all of these high and mighty opinions about things. So I recognize that, it's complicated.
Yeah, in Chile, we have the same situation. I think our position is pragmatic. Your position is idealistic, but I think we anyways benefit with your advocacy with this idealism. So keep doing it. Keep doing your dives in evidence-based medicine. And we are very thankful for your presence here for this discussion. And we will respect your time, so we will leave it to here. But thanks a lot, Manni.
The pleasure was mine. This is such a great discussion, and I got to see a completely different side of Dr. Perini. It's just very refreshing.
Ah, come on, you know me by person. I'm a nice guy.
No, I know you
are. Some Twitter hits. I mean, it's. Thank you very much, Manni.
No,
you
of
are.
course.
I mean, the reason that we discuss is because we respect your opinion, right? If you're just some people throwing crazy stuff on Twitter, would never invite you to be here with us or would never interact with you. So we definitely we are all thankful for your opinions. At the same time, I'm really glad that you're open to listen to us and see that we're in a different situation, right? We're more in a war, right, where we are fighting for the basics. But thank you very much. You are a very nice guy, and I really appreciate you taking your time to be here with us.
I so appreciate it. Learned a lot, and thank you so much for having me.
And I think it's important what you do in Twitter, that even though you criticize nicely, I think, and in a respectful way for your colleagues. So we really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you.